Hello and welcome to another video from Siderograph.com. In this video, we're going to go over some significant enhancements to the Siderograph dashboard. These enhancements both make the dashboard much easier to use, as well as adding additional functionality that, as far as I know, is not available anywhere else. Let's start with some of the minor updates, and then we'll get to some of the more significant updates. So one update that should make it more convenient to use is the scaling function that's added here. So if you look at this graph of the S&P 500, you'll see that it's relatively hard to determine when the turns take place simply because of the scaling of the graph. In the previous version of the dashboard, you would have to go to Format Axis to be able to adjust it so that the graph would become more meaningful. However, all you have to do in the new dashboard is click this button right here. After you click that button, it automatically takes into account all the scaling for you. This can save you some time. Let's start talking about what the purpose of the dashboard is. The dashboard is intended to make it easy for you to see how the security of your choice has turns that compare to turns in the Siderograph. As an example, on January 1st, 2014, the Siderograph makes a turn, and one of its component elements, the middle terms, make a turn, and the S&P 500 also makes a turn. The S&P 500 had a previous rally that went from October of 2013 through January of 2014, and it stopped at the same time that there was a turn in the Siderograph. So that's basically what it's for, but previously you weren't able to look at more than just 1 year. So previously you had to go from January 1st through December 31st of a particular year, and you couldn't see anything beyond that. In the new version of the dashboard, it shows the 3 months previous as well as the 3 months subsequent to the year. So here we have the year 2014 selected. So it shows January 1st, 2014 through December 31st, 2014. And it also has the 3 months before and 3 months after. Just like the previous version of the dashboard, you're able to graph the Siderograph and its component elements. But there is one new element that's very exciting. So if you look at the Siderograph, clearly this is a turn, and clearly this is a turn. However, there are some minor variations that are a little bit subjective. For example, is this a turn? Would this be a turn? Typically, people talk about the Siderograph turns not necessarily being more powerful if they're larger. So for example, if this is a turn, you wouldn't expect this to be any different than this turn, even if this one's a bigger turn and this is a smaller turn. However, to some extent, we need to come up with a way to figure out, is this a turn or not? What is worth looking at versus what should we ignore? So in the interest of doing that, I put together the power bars. So here's what the power bars look like for 2014. What this does is it basically looks at a variety of metrics. It's using a proprietary formula to determine which turn dates appear to be more significant than others. So clearly, these turn dates are relatively minor, and that's showing up right here because the power is less than 10. Whereas for this big turn date in the middle of the year, it shows as being 100, which is the highest value that the metric gives. So as you go through here, you can see that if there's a big turn, it has a relatively large power. And if it has a relatively small turn, it has a relatively small power. So we have this for the Siderograph as well as middle terms, long terms, and declinations. So here you can see what the turns are for 2014. So let's take a look at this. If you first start by looking at January of 2014, you'll see that there's a turn in both the Siderograph and the middle terms. However, this would have been easy to miss in the previous version of the dashboard because the previous version, if you looked at 2013, it would stop here at December 31st. And if you looked at 2014, it would start at January 1st. So there's a good chance that you could miss a turn date like this. Whereas in the current version of the dashboard, it makes it much easier to catch things like this. So if you look at this January 1st, 2014 turn date, you'll see that there's a bottom in the middle terms at the same time that there's a bottom in the Siderograph. So if we take away everything except for the power for the middle terms and the Siderograph, you'll see that, and if you can't see it, this is a red line from here to here. This is the power of the middle terms, and from here to here is the power of the Siderograph. You'll notice that this is one of the more significant dates for the entire year. So this would have helped us see in advance that this turn date around January 1st, 2014 was a pretty significant turn date. Another example is the turn date that took place in the beginning of February. So for this turn date, you'll see that there was a relatively significant power for the, this is red right here, this is the middle terms, as well as the Siderograph. So by looking at these combinations, we're able to more quickly and easily see, what are the turns that we should be looking at as compared to what are the turns that are relatively small that are not necessarily quite as significant. So let's think about the latest turn date. I believe it's around November 22nd was the latest turn date. And right around here is where the turn date took place. And you'll see that the turn date appears to be working relatively well because it indicated a change in the trend. So the S&P 500 made a pretty significant rally from this turn date in mid-October all the way up through the latest turn date on November 22nd. However, if you noticed, instead of topping and plummeting, the S&P 500 is basically leveled off where it is. So the change in trend was from an upward trend to a sideways trend. So if you come and look at the powers, you'll see that the power was relatively modest. However, if you go forward, if you look towards the turn dates that take place in early December, you'll see that you have a little bit more significant of a turn date. So let's add the long terms and declinations. So now what we see here is the turn date that took place in early October. This had a relatively large power. So this is the middle terms, and this is the Bradley Siderograph. So you can see there's a relatively large combined power that took place at this point, which would indicate that this turn date would have been a relatively strong one, just as there were two very large turns here, which resulted in a pretty strong turn date. If we take a look at the upcoming weeks, we'll notice that in early December, we're going to have a very significant turn in the long terms, and we're also going to have, shortly thereafter, a significant turn in the middle terms, and not that long after that, a very significant turn in the Bradley Siderograph itself. This tells me that there could be some pretty significant turns in the S&P 500 in the month of December. If we compare that to the most recent turn date, so this was a turn in the Siderograph around November 22nd. And the turn date appears to have worked well because it resulted in a change in trend. The S&P 500 had rallied significantly off of the previous trend from mid-October all the way up through the turn date on November 22nd. However, it went from up to flat. So it was a relatively, minor turn because it basically went to flat as compared to the S&P 500 going up and then plummeting. So if you think about it, that makes sense given that there was a relatively low power for the middle terms and the Bradley Siderograph. However, if you look towards December, you'll see that we have a very significant long terms turn here, a Bradley Siderograph turn date here, a middle terms turn date here, and then later in December, we have very significant middle terms and Bradley Siderograph turns. So this is a way to quickly and easily see that during this period of time, it's relatively quiet. Here, there's a little bit of a turn, as we saw November 22nd, and then a little bit of quiet, and then here it looks like it's a relatively big turn date. Do you see here how it's relatively clustered? And that was a pretty effective turn date. If you look over here, it's clustered. That's a pretty effective turn date. We have a cluster coming up here. This looks like it's around December 11th, give or take. So this tells me that we should be on the lookout for a possible turn at those points in time. Whereas for other dates in the future, such as this time period here, it looks like it should be relatively quiet, as well as this period here. So this is an example of how you can use the new power bars for the Bradley Siderograph to quickly get a sense for what would the likely significance of a turn date be. Once again, it's important that I emphasize that historically for the Bradley Siderograph, a larger turn has not been associated with a more significant turn. And we fully acknowledge that. The purpose of these bars is instead to focus on which turn dates are worth looking at versus which turn dates are so small that they're not necessarily even turn dates themselves. So as an example, you could set a metric for yourself where if there's a turn date that's 30 or less, or let's say 40 or less, that you would not look at them, and that you would only look at turn dates with a value of 40 or greater. This takes it from being a relatively judgmental process as far as when does a turn take place in the Siderograph to one that's more objective. Thanks for watching. On our website at bradleysiderograph.com, you can download your free copy of the Bradley Siderograph dashboard, and the premium versions contain up to 201 years of data. This additional data can be very useful if you want to do some historical backtesting to see which types of turns in either the Siderograph itself or its component elements were associated with turns in the security of your choice.